Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The late afternoon sun poured molten gold over Abuja's dusty highways, painting the city in deceptive calm. But the wailing sirens of President Sheikh Obianwa's motorcade broke that illusion. Inside the black bulletproof SUV, the president leaned back against the leather seat, listening only half-heartedly to his campaign strategist droning about poll numbers. They were slipping again. The people had grown restless, distracted by a rising chorus of scandals and whispers of corruption. He was not a man unused to political storms. They had shadowed him all his career. But this election felt different, uglier, hungrier. "Sir, we need a bold gesture," his strategist said, adjusting his glasses nervously. "Something that reminds the people you are one of them." Sheikh was about to respond when the convoy suddenly braked, the cars shuddering. Ahead, smoke and chaos whirled. A multi-vehicle pileup had turned the highway into a scene of carnage. A motorcycle lay mangled on its side, a bus had overturned, and people were screaming. His lead security man's voice crackled through the radio. "Mr. President, we have to divert." But the strategist leaned closer, his voice a serpent's whisper. This is the moment, sir. Step out. Show them the man who will walk through fire for his people." And so, with cameras clicking from the press van behind, Sheikh stepped out into the hot, choking air. The sight hit him like a blow, bodies on the asphalt, some groaning, others ominously still. His security detail swarmed around him, but his eyes locked on a young woman lying against the twisted frame of a sedan. Blood streamed from a deep gash on her temple, and her breathing was ragged, shallow. Her fingers twitched faintly, clutching at something invisible in the air. For reasons he couldn't explain, his feet moved before his mind caught up. He knelt beside her, ignoring the frantic protests of his aides. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, dark, searching, almost defiant despite the pain. "Stay with me," he heard himself say, his voice softer than he'd intended. The paramedics rushed over, their leader shaking his head grimly. "She needs blood immediately, rare type. B negative. Almost impossible to get on short notice." Without hesitation, Sheikh removed his suit jacket. "I'm B negative," he said. "Hook me up." The paramedic hesitated. This was the president of the country, but Sheikh's tone was iron. Cameras caught the moment he rolled up his sleeve, a medical kit appearing as if by magic. The world narrowed to the quiet hiss of the 4 line as his blood began flowing into her. Around them, the chaos faded into a strange hush. Even the reporters, sensing the weight of the moment, lowered their voices. Sheikh kept his gaze on the young woman's face, memorizing the curve of her jaw, the way her brows furrowed slightly even in unconsciousness. Something inside him twisted. A flicker of recognition he brushed away as adrenaline surged. The paramedic gave a small nod. The transfusion was taking, her pulse stabilizing. Sheikh exhaled slowly, unaware that the photographer crouched a few meters away had captured the exact moment his hand clasped hers, their blood linked by a thin plastic tube. That image would dominate front pages by morning, hailed as a symbol of unity and compassion. But as he stood and wiped his brow, the faint voice of his strategist rang in his ears. "This will win you the election." Sheikh didn't answer. For reasons he could not name, his thoughts were on the stranger in the ambulance, not the polls. The hospital corridors were too clean, too bright, the antiseptic scent clinging to everything like a quiet warning. Sheikh stood just outside the glass doors of the ICU, flanked by 2 bodyguards and the chief of staff. Through the transparent pane he saw her again, the young woman from the accident, lying pale against the white sheets, a network of tubes and wires keeping her tethered to life. Her name, the nurse said, was Amarachi Nwankwo, 24 years old, journalist, single. The word journalist had made his chief of staff purse his lips. "Sir, she's written some very critical pieces about your administration," the man said cautiously. "She was one of the voices accusing you of misusing rural development funds last year." Sheikh absorbed this in silence, his eyes never leaving her face. "She was a citizen in need," he said finally, his tone curt. That's all I saw today. It was true, but there was something else too. Something unsettled in the way her features stirred a half-buried memory he couldn't quite place. Inside the ICU, the presidential doctor was reviewing her charts. She stabilized, he said quietly, but it was close. She has a rare blood type, the same as yours. In fact, he paused, frowning slightly. There are some unusual genetic markers in both your profiles. Not identical, of course, but interesting. Chaik raised an eyebrow. Interesting in what way? The doctor shrugged, almost evasive. Probably nothing, sir. Just medical curiosity. Chaik let it go, at least outwardly. But the words lodged somewhere deep. A stone dropped into still water, sending ripples he would feel for days. Outside, the press had already begun spinning the story. The footage of him donating blood was everywhere, the headlines effusive. President gives blood to safe citizen. His campaign team was elated. His strategist was already planning how to weave the act into every speech. But Chaik, in a rare defiance of political instinct, had no desire to capitalize on it. Not yet. That night, back in the State House, Chaik found himself restless. He poured a drink and stood by the window, Abuja's light stretching endlessly beneath him. His life had been a series of calculated moves. Every gesture weighed, every word measured. But today had been different. Today, something in him had acted without calculation, without strategy. And now, there was this inexplicable pull toward a woman he didn't know, whose work had painted him as corrupt and self-serving. He told himself it was just the strangeness of giving blood to a stranger, the intimacy of that act. But when he closed his eyes, he saw her as she had looked on the asphalt, defiant even as life slipped away, and he knew that explanation was too simple. Tomorrow, he decided, he would visit her, not as president, as a man who wanted to understand why she had unsettled him so completely. The memory came unbidden, rising from some locked corner of his mind, 19 years ago, when he was not the president, not even a politician, but just Chaik, a lanky second-year economics student at Nsukka with more dreams and money. He had been working weekends at a small tailor's shop to afford his textbooks. That was where he first saw Chinelo. She was the seamstress's daughter, sharp-eyed and quick-witted, with laughter that came like a breeze in the dry heat. She wasn't beautiful in the way glossy magazines defined beauty, but she had a presence that drew people in. They started talking over shared shifts, and soon those conversations spilled into long walks through the dusty streets, cheap meals under flickering bulbs, and plans whispered into the humid night. She made him feel invincible, as if the world could not touch them. When she told him she was pregnant, his first reaction had been disbelief, followed by a strange, fierce joy. He was 20, broke and barely scraping by, but the idea of building a family with her seemed right. Then reality came knocking in the form of Chief Damien Obianwu, his political mentor, and the man who had paid his tuition in exchange for loyal service. Damien did not shout. He didn't need to. He simply called Chinelo into his office one afternoon while Chaik was in class, and by the time Chaik got there, she was gone. The chief told him flatly that she had come to her senses, and decided she didn't want to ruin her life with a penniless dreamer. Weeks later, Damien handed Chaik an envelope and said, "It's over." She had an abortion. The pain had been like swallowing glass, but Chaik had no power to challenge him. He buried himself in politics, telling himself that love was a luxury for men who could afford to lose. Back in the present, Chaik stood at the foot of Amarachi's hospital bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. He had come under the cover of night, no media, no aides, only a single bodyguard at the door. He didn't know why he felt the need to see her like this, vulnerable, untouched by the political games outside. Her face was calmer now, the lines of pain softened by sleep. But there was something there, in the angle of her cheekbones, in the stubborn set of her jaw, something that made his breath catch in his throat, as if the past were reaching through the years to tap him on the shoulder. He shook it off and left quietly, telling himself it was nothing but coincidence. Yet, as he stepped into the corridor, he could almost hear Chinelo's laughter echoing faintly in his memory, and it unsettled him more than any political scandal ever had. The news cycle was relentless. For 3 days straight, the image of President Chike Obianwu donating blood to a wounded journalist dominated television screens, newspaper covers, and online feeds. Commentators debated the sincerity of the gesture. Political analysts argued over whether it was a calculated move or an act of genuine compassion. And ordinary Nigerians split along familiar lines of cynicism and hope. Within the State House, the political team treated it like gold. Every speech, every public engagement was now framed against that photograph. The president as a man of the people. But in the quiet of his office, Chike found the whole circus strangely hollow. He had not stepped into that street to win votes. Something far more instinctive had guided him. That same instinct was stirred again when his campaign strategist, F, entered with a folder in hand. "Sir, I've been thinking, we can't let this story fade. We need a living reminder of it." "Bring her in," F suggested. Chike raised an eyebrow. "Bring her in?" "Yes, sir. A communications role in the presidency. She'll be the walking proof of your compassion. And more importantly, she can't be used against you if she's under our roof." It was shrewd politics, the kind Chike had built his career on. Still, he hesitated, the image of her unconscious in the ICU flickering in his mind. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Make the offer. But tell her it's her choice, no strings." Amarachi received the call 2 days later while sitting in the cramped newsroom of the Daily Pulse. Her editor, Mr. Allowale, was practically salivating when she told him, "Do you have any idea what this means, Amarachi? Access. You'll be on the inside. Think of the stories we could break." Amarachi frowned, her fingers tightening on the edge of her desk. She had built her reputation on exposing corruption, on holding power to account, not cozying up to it. But she also knew that such an opportunity could be a goldmine for investigative journalism. She imagined walking the corridors of the presidency, hearing conversations no outsider could hear. The danger, of course, was being drawn in, the same danger every journalist faced when proximity blurred the lines between observation and loyalty. "I'll think about it," she told Allowale, though in truth, her mind was already leaning toward yes. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering the president's face hovering over hers on the asphalt. She hated that she remembered the warmth in his voice when he told her to stay with me. It was an image she didn't want lodged in her mind, but it wouldn't leave. The next morning, she accepted the offer. The call from the State House was brisk and efficient, setting her start date for the following week. When she arrived, she was met not with fanfare, but with quiet efficiency, an ID badge, a packet of rules, and a quick tour of the sprawling marble halls. Chike wasn't there to greet her personally. Her first meeting with him as an employee would come later. Still, she felt his presence in every room, his influence in every hushed corridor. That evening, as she left the gates, her phone buzzed. It was Allowale. "Remember, Amarachi, you're not there for them. You're there for us. Get close, but don't forget, this man is dangerous." His voice lingered in her mind like smoke long after she ended the call. She didn't know it yet, but she was stepping into a world where every smile had a calculation, and every gesture, no matter how kind, could have two meanings. The grandeur of the State House was almost disorienting. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and uniformed aides moved like clockwork, each one knowing exactly where to be and when. Amarachi felt like an intruder, though she kept her posture straight and her expression calm. She had been placed under the direct supervision of the communications director, Mrs. Temelade, a brisk woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and little patience for small talk. "Your job is simple," Temelade said as they walked past a row of offices. "You'll prepare briefings, review press materials, and ensure all public statements align with the president's vision. And before you ask, yes, every word you write will be vetted." Amarachi nodded, filing the information away. Every room they passed seemed steeped in quiet power. Walls lined with books, maps dotted with strategic markers, phones that could connect to anywhere in the world with a single call. She could already feel the weight of the institution pressing in on her, threatening to make her forget why she had come. She saw him for the first time that afternoon. Chike entered the press briefing room in a dark blue suit, his stride purposeful but unhurried. Conversations died as he approached. Amarachi stood at the back, clutching a folder, trying not to stare. He began speaking to the press team about an upcoming televised address, his voice calm, authoritative, carrying the subtle cadence of a man who knew the power of every syllable. Then, unexpectedly, his gaze landed on her. "You're the young woman from the accident," he said, not as a question but a statement. Amarachi swallowed. "Yes, sir." A faint smile touched his lips. "I'm glad to see you on your feet." It was a small thing, a polite acknowledgement, but it hit her harder than she expected. As the meeting went on, she found herself answering one of his questions directly, offering a concise suggestion for rephrasing a statement to sound more authentic. He considered it for a moment, then nodded. "Good point. Let's use that." The room shifted slightly, aides glancing at her with new interest or suspicion. Later, as she was leaving the briefing, she walked down a quiet hallway to collect some printouts. That was when she heard it, the faint, almost unconscious sound of someone humming. It took her a second to recognize the tune, but when she did, her breath caught. It was the lullaby her mother used to hum when she couldn't sleep as a child, a melody woven into her earliest memories. She turned the corner and froze. It was the president. He was leaning against the wall, reviewing a folder, humming that same tune under his breath before catching himself and stopping. Amarachi's mind raced. How could he possibly know it? She stepped forward, about to ask, but he looked up, and the moment vanished. "Good work today," he said simply, before walking away. She stood there, the notes of the lullaby still echoing in her mind, a seed of unease planting itself deep inside her. That night, Chike sat alone in his private study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, the low hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. He hadn't even realized he'd been humming the lullaby until he saw the flicker of recognition in Amarachi's eyes earlier. The melody had come from a place so deep he rarely visited it, the memory of evenings with Chinello, when she would hum the tune while mending clothes or sitting beside him on the narrow bed in his student apartment. It wasn't a song you'd hear on the radio, not a popular hymn or cultural chant. It was theirs. How Amarachi knew it was a question that had no logical answer. The thought unsettled him, but he brushed it aside. Still, curiosity gnawed at him. The next day, he asked his secretary to discreetly obtain Amarachi's personnel file. He expected to find something concrete, a birthplace, a family background, that might explain the uncanny familiarity. Instead, the file was frustratingly sparse. Basic details, a record of employment at the Daily Pulse, and a note about her mother, Chinello Nwankwo, a retired seamstress living in Enugu. His hand paused over that name. Chinello. There were many Chinellos in Nigeria, he told himself. But the coincidence burned like a coal in his chest. While Chike wrestled with that private disquiet, Amarachi's day unfolded with its own odd turn. She was at her desk, typing a summary of the president's upcoming radio interview, when she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. A man in a gray suit was standing just a little too close to her workspace, pretending to examine a wall map, but angling his phone toward her desk. Her instincts, honed by years in journalism, screamed surveillance. She shifted her papers slightly, blocking his view, and turned to face him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cool. He muttered something about being lost and walked away, but not before she caught the faint flash of a camera app closing on his screen. Her skin prickled. Someone was watching her, but was it the president's people or someone else entirely? By evening, both she and Chike were thinking about the other, though for very different reasons. She wondered why a head of state would hum a lullaby only her mother ever sang, while he found himself asking why a young journalist's presence could stir the ghosts of a love he'd been forced to bury 2 decades ago. Neither of them spoke of it. But in the spaces between words, in the fleeting glances that passed in the corridors of the State House, something was shifting, a connection forming quietly, without permission, like a seed germinating in darkness. And somewhere beyond those marble walls, there were people watching them both, waiting for the right moment to strike. The following week began with an unexpected summons. Amarachi had just settled at her desk, sorting through a stack of press clippings, when Mrs. Temalade appeared, her expression unusually neutral. "The president wants to see you," she said, as if the words were stones she had to spit out. Amarachi's stomach tightened. She followed Temelade through the maze of corridors to Chike's private meeting room, a smaller, less formal space than his office, but still heavy with the scent of polished wood and quiet authority. Chike sat at the head of a table, a few files spread before him. He gestured for her to sit. "Amarachi," he began, his tone calm but deliberate, "I've been observing your work these past 2 weeks. You have a knack for clarity, cutting through the noise to the core of a message. I need that skill for something important." He slid a manila folder toward her. "This is a draft outline for the Rural Development Project in the Northeast. It's a flagship program, but it's politically sensitive. I want you to review the communications plan and make recommendations. And I want you to keep this strictly confidential." Her fingers brushed the folder, the weight of the responsibility sinking in. She was being asked to handle a project that could sway public perception, and perhaps even votes, in key regions. But the moment she returned to her desk, the phone rang. It was Allowale, her editor, and his voice was almost gleeful. "I heard from a friend in the press corps that you've been given access to something big. Don't play dumb. I want a copy of whatever lands on your desk. We could expose how much of that project is just campaign optics." Amarachi's jaw clenched. "You're asking me to risk my job and possibly my freedom," she said sharply. Allowale laughed. "You're a journalist, Amarachi. We take risks for the truth. Or have you forgotten which side you're on?" The words cut deep. She had never seen her role as being on a side. She believed in facts, in holding everyone accountable. But now, sitting in the heart of political power with the president's trust, the lines were beginning to blur. That night, she sat in her small apartment, the folder on the coffee table before her. She could feel the invisible tug-of-war between two worlds, the newsroom that had given her purpose, and the corridors of the State House that had given her access. She opened the folder, scanning its contents. The project, at least on paper, seemed well-intentioned. Infrastructure repairs, clean water systems, agricultural support. But she also saw vague budget lines, contractors with opaque histories, and language that could easily be spun. She knew Allowale would pounce on those gaps. She also knew that handing him this information could destroy the fragile trust Chike had placed in her. She closed the folder, exhaling slowly. For the first time, she wasn't sure if telling the truth was the same as doing the right thing. The next morning, Amarachi made a decision, one she wasn't proud of. She slipped the folder into her tote bag, telling herself she would only make a copy for her own reference before returning it. She would decide later whether to pass it to Allowale. The weight of it felt almost physical as she walked into the briefing room, where the president's team was preparing for a press release. She took a seat at the side, pretending to review her notes. But just as she was tucking the folder deeper into her bag, the room fell quiet. She looked up, and there was Chike standing in the doorway, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on her. "Amarachi," he said evenly, a word. Her pulse jumped. She followed him into the hallway, her mind racing. Had he seen? He didn't mention the folder. Instead, he spoke about the upcoming trip to the Northeast, asking her to help prepare briefing materials for the local governors. His tone was calm, but there was a subtle intensity in his eyes, as though he sensed something but chose not to confront it directly. "You're new here," he said finally, "but you've handled yourself well under pressure. Just remember, in this building, trust is earned in grains and lost in buckets." The words lingered like a warning as he walked away. Amarachi stood there, her palms damp, realizing that in his own way, he had just told her he was watching. Later that afternoon, as the staff dispersed for lunch, Amarachi slipped into the media room to scan a few pages from a folder. She had just placed them under the copier when the door swung open. It was Mrs. Temelade. "What are you doing?" Temelade's eyes darted to the copier screen. Amarachi forced a smile. "Just making copies of the press schedule." Temelade's gaze lingered for a moment longer before she walked out, but Amarachi knew the woman wasn't convinced. That evening, her phone buzzed again, Allowale. "So, did you get it?" She hesitated, then told him she needed more time. His voice hardened. Don't go native on me, Amarachi. If you start thinking he's one of the good ones, you'll lose your edge. When she hung up, she realized that for the first time, she wasn't sure Allowale's version of truth was hers anymore. Far from Abuja's marble halls, in a small, weather-worn house on the outskirts of Enugu, Chinelo Nwankwo sat by the window, mending a torn blouse. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, but her mind was far away, back to the years when Amarachi was small and the world felt much more dangerous. Chinelo had been just 21 when she gave birth, alone in a rented room with no family nearby. She had been too proud to go back to her parents, who had warned her against the boy she loved. She worked any job she could find, sewing, cleaning, selling fruit by the roadside. Every night, she would hum the lullaby her own mother had sung to her, watching Amarachi's tiny chest rise and fall. She never spoke of Chike except to say that he chose power over us. It wasn't entirely true, but it was easier than explaining the web of threats and money that had pulled them apart. When Amarachi was 12, Chinelo fell ill with typhoid and nearly died. A neighbor cared for the girl, while Chinelo lay in a clinic bed, the bills mounting. It was then Amarachi learned what desperation looked like. Her mother selling the last of her gold earrings, walking miles to borrow money from relatives who turned their backs. That resilience, that refusal to bow, became Amarachi's compass. But so did the quiet bitterness that sometimes leaked into her mother's voice, the way her eyes hardened whenever politics was mentioned. To Chinelo, politicians were not just liars, they were thieves of lives and futures. Back in the present, Amarachi walked home after a long day, the weight of the folder still heavy in her bag. As she approached her street, she noticed a black SUV parked near the corner, its engine idling. At first, she thought nothing of it, until she saw the faint glow of a cigarette behind the tinted glass, and the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She quickened her pace, her heart hammering. The SUV didn't move, but she knew instinctively that it hadn't been there by accident. That night, lying in bed, she thought of her mother's warnings about the dangerous games politicians played, and for the first time since starting at the State House, she wondered if she was in over her head. It happened just after dusk, when the sky was the color of bruised steel and the street lamps had just begun to flicker on. Amarachi was walking home from the small corner shop where she'd picked up bread and milk. The day at the State House had been tense, a flurry of meetings about the president's upcoming trip to the Northeast, and she was looking forward to a quiet evening. She had just turned into the narrow lane leading to her apartment when a shadow moved in her peripheral vision. Before she could react, a van screeched to a halt beside her. Two masked men jumped out, their footsteps heavy on the asphalt. One grabbed her arm, so hard it sent a sharp pain shooting up to her shoulder, while the other yanked her tote bag away and flung it onto the ground. "Stay away from the president's secrets," one hissed in a low, dangerous voice, "or you'll regret you were ever born." The words were cold and deliberate, each one designed to sink into her bones. She tried to pull free, but the grip on her arm tightened. For a moment, she thought they were going to drag her into the van, until the sound of footsteps and a man's voice shouting made them release her. They jumped back into the vehicle, which roared off into the night. The stranger who had shouted was an older man who ran the kiosk across the street. He came over, breathless, and asked if she was all right. Amarachi could barely respond. Her pulse was still thundering in her ears. She gathered her things from the ground, her hands trembling as she clutched the folder she had been carrying. It had fallen out of her bag, but miraculously remained unopened. The encounter had been quick, but it felt like an eternity. She knew instinctively that this was no random mugging. This was a warning, precise, targeted, and meant to scare her into silence. And it was working. That night, she sat in her darkened apartment, the bread and milk untouched on the table, replaying the scene over and over. Her mind kept circling back to the same question. Who had sent them? The opposition? Someone from the president's camp? Or someone entirely different who feared what she might uncover? The next morning, the incident was reported to security, not by her, but by the kiosk owner, who had recognized the danger of what he'd seen. Within an hour, The State House had dispatched a small team to investigate. Amarachi was called into a side office where the head of presidential security questioned her. She gave them the facts, leaving out her growing suspicion that it might have something to do with the Rural Development Project files. When the questioning ended, she was told in clipped tones that the president would be informed immediately. Part of her wanted to object, to keep this out of his sight, but deep down she knew it was already beyond her control. Whoever had sent those men wasn't done. And the next time, she might not be so lucky. Chaik was in a meeting with his security chiefs when the report landed on his desk. The language was clinical, verbal threat, possible intimidation attempt, subject unharmed. But the moment he saw Amarachi's name, something shifted in him. He dismissed the room and called for his driver. Within the hour, he was standing at the threshold of her apartment. 2 bodyguards posted discreetly outside. Amarachi opened the door, startled, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. She had never seen him outside the formal confines of the State House. No suit jacket, just a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, the first few buttons undone. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice carrying both command and something gentler. She nodded, but the truth was written all over her face, the faint swelling on her wrist, the tension in her shoulders. "You shouldn't be walking these streets alone," he said, stepping inside before she could protest. He stayed longer than she expected, asking about the attack in detail. When she hesitated to answer certain questions, he didn't press, but his eyes told her he noticed. "You'll have a security detail from now on," he said finally. Non-negotiable. She wanted to argue, to insist she could take care of herself, but part of her was relieved. In the quiet that followed, they found themselves sitting opposite each other at her small dining table. His gaze drifted to a framed photograph on the wall, a much younger Amarachi with a woman who could only be her mother. "Is that your mother?" he asked. "Yes." "Chinello," she replied. For a moment he didn't react, but inside, the name hit him like a stone in still water. It couldn't be the same Chinello, he told himself, but the thought lodged there, unshakable. When he left, the air in the room felt heavier, as if something unsaid had taken up residence between them. Amarachi watched from the window as his convoy pulled away, the black SUVs disappearing down the road. She couldn't deny it. There was a familiarity in the way he had looked at her mother's picture, a flicker of recognition he had tried to mask. That night, she found herself scrolling through old photos on her phone, lingering on the few rare images of her mother smiling. She wondered if the president, the most powerful man in the country, could possibly have crossed paths with her in some hidden chapter of their lives. And if he had, what would that mean for the secrets her mother had kept for so long? The following week, the State House was in uproar. A breaking news bulletin had just hit the airwaves, a leaked document allegedly proving that Amarachi had been involved in manipulating voter data for the ruling party. The evidence was laughably crude to anyone who worked in tech, but in the world of politics, perception often mattered more than truth. The opposition seized on it immediately, calling for her arrest, and an investigation into why the president had placed a known saboteur in the heart of government. Amarachi sat frozen at her desk as her phone exploded with messages, some from friends asking if it was true, others from unknown numbers calling her a traitor. She could feel eyes on her from every corner of the office. Even Mrs. Temelade's usual briskness was laced with suspicion as she told Amarachi to remain in place until further notice. By midday, 2 plainclothes security officers appeared, badges out, ready to escort her for questioning. Her pulse spiked. She knew how quickly such an arrest could spiral, how the media could turn it into a spectacle. She was halfway out of her chair when a voice cut through the tension. "No one touches her without my permission." It was Chaik, standing in the doorway, his presence filling the room. The officers froze. "She works for me," he continued, his tone sharp as a blade. "If you have questions, they go through me." Amarachi stared at him, stunned. She had expected him to distance himself from her at the first sign of scandal. It was what any politically savvy leader would do. But instead, he was shielding her, putting his own name and position in the line of fire. The room emptied quickly after that, but the damage had been done. The leak had planted seeds of doubt in the public's mind, and Amarachi knew they would not be easily erased. As she left the building later that day, under the watchful eyes of her newly assigned security detail, she noticed a black sedan idling near the gate. A figure sat in the driver's seat, his face obscured by shadows. Her instincts told her he was watching her, and that whoever had orchestrated the leak wasn't finished yet. Somewhere in the background of all this chaos, threads were being pulled, and she was tangled in the middle of a web she hadn't fully seen yet. The air in Abuja had that heavy, pre-storm stillness that made the city feel like it was holding its breath. Amarachi had stayed late at the State House, finishing the final drafts of briefing notes for the president's trip to the Northeast. Most of the staff had already left, and her assigned security detail was waiting at the front gate. She decided to take a shortcut through the quieter East Wing, her heels clicking against the marble floors. The hall was dimly lit, shadows pooling in the corners, and for a moment she thought she heard footsteps behind her. She told herself it was nothing, until a rough hand clamped over her mouth. The smell of sweat and engine oil filled her nostrils as two masked men dragged her into an unlit storage room. Her phone clattered to the floor. The taller one pressed her against the wall, his voice a low growl. "We told you to stay away. You didn't listen." She struggled, kicking at their shins, but the shorter one swung a fist into her ribs, knocking the air from her lungs. Pain exploded in her side, but fear kept her mind razor-sharp. They didn't try to rob her. They were here for something else entirely. One pulled out a small switchblade, pressing it lightly against her cheek, not cutting, just letting her feel the cold steel. "Next time," he said, "we won't miss." She could hear her own heartbeat roaring in her ears, her thoughts narrowing to survival. Somewhere outside, the faint sound of footsteps approached, then a shout, followed by the thud of heavy boots. The door burst open and the two attackers bolted, slipping into the dark hallway before her stunned security detail could grab them. One of the guards stayed with her while the other gave chase, but the men vanished into the maze of service corridors. Amarachi sank to the floor, clutching her side, trying to steady her breathing. This wasn't just a warning anymore. This was an escalation. Whoever was behind it wanted her gone, permanently. By the time she reached the hospital, her vision was blurring from a combination of shock and pain. She barely registered the doctors moving around her until she heard a familiar voice. Chaik was suddenly at her side, his expression hard and unreadable, but his hand was steady as he brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. "You're safe now," he said, though they both knew safety was a fragile thing. The doctor explained she'd lost more blood than expected from an internal injury to her rib area. She'd need another transfusion, and her rare B-negative type was proving difficult to source quickly. Without hesitation, Chaik offered his arm. "I'll do it again," he told the medical staff. They hesitated, glancing at each other, before preparing the equipment. As the needle slid in, Amarachi, half-conscious, opened her eyes just enough to see him watching her, not like a politician protecting a staff member, but like a man holding on to something he didn't understand yet. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the soft murmur of the medical staff. It was standard protocol, the doctor explained, to check for compatibility before any transfusion, even with a known donor like the president. And because this was the second time within weeks that Chaik had given blood to the same recipient, the system automatically flagged unusual matches. What started as a routine cross-match led the chief medical officer to run a more detailed analysis, partly out of curiosity, partly out of the odd genetic similarities he'd noticed the first time. The results came back after midnight, the printer spitting out a sheet of data that made him stop breathing for a moment. It was there in black and white. The probability that President Chaik Obianwu was Amarachi Nwankwo's biological father was more than 99.9%. The weight of that knowledge pressed on him like a stone. This wasn't just medical trivia. This was a political bomb, one that could blow apart the highest office in the land. For several hours, the doctor wrestled with what to do. Telling Chaik meant risking a scandal that could destroy his presidency. Not telling him meant living with the knowledge that he had withheld something deeply personal and potentially life-changing from both father and daughter. He finally made the decision in the early hours of the morning, walking into the private waiting room where Chike sat with a cup of untouched coffee. "Sir," the doctor began carefully, "there's something you need to know. It concerns Miss Nwankwo." Chike set the cup down slowly, his eyes narrowing at the doctor's tone. The words that followed didn't feel real as they left the doctor's mouth. That Amarachi was almost certainly his child. For a moment, Chike just stared, his mind flailing for a foothold in a reality that had shifted in an instant. The memories of Chinello, the girl he'd loved and lost, rushed back with dizzying clarity. Could it be possible? Had she carried the pregnancy after all, and never told him? He didn't respond immediately. He asked for the full report, read it twice, then leaned back in his chair, his jaw set. "No one outside this room knows?" he asked. The doctor confirmed it. Chike's instinct was to confront Amarachi immediately, but something held him back. She was still unconscious, recovering from the attack. Dropping this revelation on her now would be reckless. He needed answers from someone else first, someone who had been there 19 years ago, when his life had been pulled away from Chinello's. And there was only one person who could give him those answers. The call to Enugu was made before dawn. Within hours, a secure State House vehicle was on its way to bring Chinello Nwankwo to Abuja. She arrived looking wary, her eyes flicking around the plush private sitting room as if it were a trap. Chike entered, and for a moment the years fell away. She was older, her hair streaked with gray, but her presence was unchanged, the same quiet strength, the same guarded expression. "Chinello," he began, his voice low, "I need to know the truth. Amarachi, is she my daughter?" She looked at him for a long time, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry 2 decades of weight, she nodded. "Yes, she's yours." The words cracked something open in him. Relief, grief, and anger all tangled together. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded. Her eyes flashed. "Because I didn't have a choice. Your mentor came to my family. He said you wanted nothing to do with me, that you'd already agreed to end it. He paid them to send me away and threatened us if we came back. I thought you had abandoned us." She went on to describe the years of struggle. The night Amarachi was born in a dimly lit room with only a neighbor's wife to help, the endless jobs, the times she went without food so her daughter could eat. She spoke without bitterness, but every word was edged with the kind of truth that could not be softened. "I wanted to tell her about you," Chinello admitted, "but what good would it have done? She would have grown up resenting a man she thought had thrown her away." Chike listened in silence, the realization settling over him like a storm. All these years, he had believed the lie that she had chosen to end the pregnancy. All these years, his daughter had lived in the shadows of his life without him knowing. "She's here now," he said finally, "and I will tell her myself." Chinello shook her head. "She's not ready. She's been through too much. Let her heal first." But fate had other plans. Later that day, Amarachi woke in her hospital bed to find Chike sitting in a chair beside her, his gaze fixed on her face, as if committing every detail to memory. There was a tightness in his jaw, but his voice was gentle when he spoke. "We need to talk," he said. She could see something different in his eyes, something deeper than the professional courtesy he had shown her before. "What about?" she asked. He hesitated, the weight of the truth poised on his tongue, when a knock came at the door. A nurse entered to check her vitals, breaking the moment. But even as the nurse worked, Amarachi could feel it. The air between them was no longer the same. Something was coming, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. The following evening, Chike returned to the hospital alone. No aides, no security in the room, just him, dressed in a plain charcoal shirt and trousers, carrying a small fruit basket that felt almost absurdly inadequate for what he was about to do. Amarachi was sitting up in bed, her face pale but her eyes alert. He stood there for a moment, studying her, before setting the basket on the bedside table. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice steady but threaded with a weight that made her straighten in alarm. He pulled a chair closer and sat, resting his forearms on his knees. "What I'm about to say will change how you see me, and maybe yourself." She blinked, her fingers tightening around the blanket. You're making it sound like a confession, she said cautiously. His eyes held hers. It is. Amarachi, I'm your father. The words seemed to hang in the air, dense and immovable. At first, she thought she'd misheard him. A hollow laugh escaped her lips. That's not funny, she said, shaking her head. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheet, the DNA report, stamped and signed by the chief medical officer. He placed it on her lap. I didn't know, he said quietly. Not until now. I was told your mother had ended the pregnancy. I only found out the truth yesterday from her. Her mind reeled. She wanted to deny it, to throw the paper back at him and accuse him of some manipulative political stunt. But somewhere deep in her gut, there was a recognition she couldn't shake. The same rare blood type, the way his eyes mirrored hers, the strange sense of familiarity that had unnerved her from the start. All my life, she said finally, her voice low, my mother told me you chose power over us. His jaw tightened. She believed I had. I believed she didn't want me. We were both lied to. The silence that followed was thick with years they had lost. Anger flared hot in her chest. You're the president of this country, she said sharply. Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up fatherless, watching your mother work herself to the bone just so you could eat? And now you want to stand here and... Her voice broke, and she turned away, staring at the wall. Chaik swallowed hard, resisting the urge to reach for her. I'm not asking you to forgive me today, he said. I'm asking for the chance to be in your life, not as your president, but as your father. Unbeknownst to them, a small pinhole camera, hidden in the bouquet of flowers on her nightstand, blinked faintly, transmitting every word to someone outside. In less than 24 hours, their most private moment would become the nation's newest scandal. The leak hit like a thunderclap. By mid-morning the next day, a grainy video was circulating across social media platforms. The president of Nigeria, sitting at the bedside of a young woman, telling her he was her father. It had been edited for maximum damage, cutting away his explanation, and leaving only the explosive statement and Amarachi's emotional reaction. News anchors spoke of nothing else. Opposition leaders pounced, accusing Chaik of nepotism for planting his secret daughter in the heart of government. Talk shows speculated about Amarachi's paternity, some suggesting she was the product of an affair, others painting her as a manipulative opportunist. Within hours, Amarachi's face was on every screen, her private life dissected by strangers. At the State House, the mood was grim. Chaik's chief of staff burst into his office with a stack of printouts, his voice clipped. Sir, this is a crisis. They're saying you used public office to give her a job. They're questioning the legitimacy of every decision she's touched. Chaik listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. We respond with the truth, he said finally. We release the full recording and show what was left out. But the communications team hesitated. Sir, the public has already made up its mind. This will be a long fight. Chaik's jaw set in the way it did when he'd already decided to walk into fire. Then we fight. Meanwhile, Amarachi was holed up in her apartment, her phone buzzing with calls from journalists, old classmates, and strangers offering unsolicited advice. She ignored them all. The betrayal of their conversation being recorded cut deep, not just because of the political fallout, but because it made her wonder if there was any place left where she could feel safe. By nightfall, the scandal had taken an even darker turn. Anonymous death threats flooded Amarachi's email and social media accounts. Some were graphic, others more calculated, warning her to step away from the president before it's too late. Chaik's security team insisted on moving her to a safe location, but she resisted until she received a chilling message, a photograph of her mother, taken from outside their Enugu home, with a caption that read, "We can reach anyone." That broke her resolve. She called Chaik herself, her voice shaking. "I'll go wherever you say," she told him. He didn't hesitate. "Pack a bag. I'm sending a convoy tonight." Neither of them knew that the most immediate danger wouldn't come from shadows. It would come in daylight, less than 24 hours later, in full view of the public. The rally in Port Harcourt had been planned weeks in advance as part of Chaik's re-election tour. Despite the scandal, he refused to cancel. insisting that retreat would only embolden his enemies. Amarachi had been moved to a discreet safe house on the outskirts of the city, but she insisted on meeting him privately before he went on stage. They were seated in a small back room of the venue, the sound of the growing crowd a low roar beyond the walls. Chaik leaned forward, his hands clasped. "They'll try to use you to get to me," he said. "You'll be safer if we limit our public contact for now." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm not hiding. Not anymore. If I'm your daughter, I'm not going to live like a ghost." He felt a flicker of pride at her resolve, but also the cold grip of fear, the kind a father feels when he knows danger is closing in. Minutes later, he stepped out onto the stage to a sea of waving flags and roaring voices. Amarachi stood just offstage, watching him address the crowd with the same charisma that had carried him from a poor university student to the highest office in the land. The speech was going well, too well. It was in the middle of a rousing call for unity that it happened. A sharp crack split the air, followed by another. For a heartbeat, the crowd didn't react, but Chaik's security detail did, shoving him to the ground, their bodies forming a human shield. Amarachi felt a searing rush of panic as she saw the jagged hole in the stage backdrop and realized what it meant. A sniper. The next moments blurred into chaos, screams, the stampede of feet, the deafening echo of return fire from the security team. When it was over, the would-be assassin was gone, melting into the chaos of the fleeing crowd. Chaik was unharmed, but the message was clear. This wasn't just political theater anymore. Someone wanted him, and perhaps her, dead. That night, in the fortified safe house where they were both taken, he sat across from her at a small table. The storm outside rattled the windows, but his voice was calm. "They want to scare us into silence," he said, "but I won't give them that. If I lose the presidency, I still win my daughter." The words landed heavily between them. For Amarachi, the meaning was clear. Whatever battles lay ahead, they would fight them together, and the war was just beginning. The safe house had that transient smell of clean carpets and recycled air, the kind of place meant to keep people alive rather than make them comfortable. Amarachi sat at the small dining table with cold tea in a chipped mug, the steam long gone, her phone face down beside a muted television that scrolled endless commentary about her life. Every channel was a mirror she didn't ask for, pundits dissecting her childhood, her ethics, her alleged placement inside the State House. One tabloid paraded a former classmate who claimed she'd always liked powerful men, and another ran grainy shots of Chinello sweeping outside their Enugu flat, overlaid with a cruel caption about poverty to power. Amarachi wanted to smash the television. Instead, she breathed through the anger. It wasn't the first time journalism had taught her that truth and spectacle weren't the same. But now the spectacle wore her face. Across from her, a female security officer named Beezy was quietly folding a map, pretending not to watch. "They'll say worse by morning," Beezy murmured, tone gentle in a way that made it bearable. "What matters is what you choose to say back." Amarachi nodded, hearing her own heartbeat more than the words. The president's senior staff had come and gone, leaving behind a tight plan. Lie low, let the story cool, let the lawyers and spokespeople trade statements in the mud, while she stayed pristine and unseen. It was smart. It was survivable. It was also the opposite of everything she believed about life and accountability. A woman raised by Chinello did not let other people carry her voice. When the line to Enugu crackled and Chinello's voice arrived, soft, cautious, a little tired, the room shifted into the past. "Ma," Amarachi said, and the syllable almost broke her. She told her mother about the safe house, the shot-out rally backdrop, the headlines. She did not say assassination attempt, because there are some phrases a daughter cannot offer a mother who once sold earrings to pay for antibiotics. Chinello listened in the old way, with the patience of poverty and the spine of a survivor. "You were born in the dark of a power outage," she said, a smile audible through the line. "I held you while the neighbor waved a hand fan and prayed. From that night, I knew your life would be your own fight. Not mine, not any man's." Amarachi closed her eyes, feeling the words tighten the bow of her resolve. If I stand with him publicly, she asked, are you ashamed of me? Silence, then a firm answer. I am ashamed of people who hide, not of daughters who speak. There it was, the permission she hadn't known she needed. After they hung up, she stared at her reflection in the dark window. The same cheekbones as the president, the same stubborn eyes, and years of truth-telling behind them. To speak now would be to stand against two storms at once, the political machine that wanted her silenced and the opposition that wanted her weaponized. But to remain silent would be a betrayal of the woman who hummed lullabies over a plastic basin and counted coins by candlelight. She turned the phone upright, typed a single message to the chief of staff, I will speak, on my terms, and press send. The next day moved like a heist. Security replanned the venue for a televised rally in Abuja. More cameras, more controlled entry, more rooftops staffed by counter-snipers who looked like dots against the sky. The communications team wanted a vetted statement, a neat paragraph that could be printed and sliced into sound bites. Amarachi shook her head. I'll say the truth, she insisted. The strategist with shark eyes and an unflappable tie, tried to corral her words into safer lanes. The truth can be edited, he warned, tapping the table. Your sentences need helmets. She almost laughed at that, helmets for words, but didn't. In the holding room, Chike paced like a man rehearsing an apology he could never fully finish. He asked if she was sure, if she wanted to navigate the mob of opinions and algorithms. They'll tear you apart, he said, and the fear in his voice was not presidential. It was paternal, naked, and late. They already did, she replied, fastening a simple blouse button with steady fingers. She reached for the small bracelet Chinello had given her at 18, cheap, silver-painted, but indestructible, and slid it on as if it were armor. In the hallway, a junior aide pressed a mic pack into her hand, whispering good luck like a confession. Then the stage manager's hand lifted, the cue light went green, and Amarachi stepped into the white heat of the cameras, choosing to meet the country's gaze rather than hide from it. The roar of the crowd curled into her like a wave. Somewhere behind the wing, she felt Chike's presence, an orbit reshaped. The next 10 minutes would not fix history, but they would set its direction. The light was surgical, stadium bright, indiscriminate, unforgiving, the kind that turns nuance into either halo or shadow depending on who's holding the camera. Amarachi walked to the lectern, the weight of 1,000 eyes, 1,000,000 screens, and 2 decades pressing across her ribs. She did not clear her throat. She did not smooth her blouse. She looked in the rows and imagined only 3 faces. The neighbor who begged the clinic nurse to do just one more drip when Chinello's fever burned. The kiosk owner who shouted at masked men and scared them away with nothing but courage. And the president, as he had looked on asphalt, sleeves rolled, blood flowing, a human act before a political one. My name is Amarachi Nwankwo, she began, her voice steady, the mix faint hiss like wind before rain. I grew up with a mother who taught me that truth is not a headline. It is a debt we pay to the people who fed us when we were hungry and listened when we had no credentials. I became a journalist because of her. I took a job in the presidency because I believed access could serve the public interest. And I remained when it would have been easier to run because I realized the story was bigger than me. A murmur rippled forward. She let it pass. 2 weeks ago, I learned something that altered my life. The president who gave me blood to keep me alive is my biological father. He did not know. I did not know. We were separated by lies and power and a system that eats the poor and leaves them grateful for the crumbs. That is not a scandal. That is a wound. And wounds require light to heal. She did not rush. She laid out the contours without melodrama. A university romance muted by a political mentor's money and menace. A seamstress's daughter who said yes to love and woke up exiled. A child who grew into a woman with a pen, not a last name. A head of state who mistook survival for abandonment and built walls where a door had been locked from the outside. If you came here for gossip, she said, the corners of her mouth lifting with something like apology, you will be disappointed. I will not perform my mother's pain for ratings, and I will not apologize for the blood in my veins. I did not ask to be born the president's daughter. I chose to be a Nigerian who demands accountability, including from him. That line tightened the air. Some clapped, some hissed, all listened. If you believe I was planted, she continued, ask yourself why the first time he saw me on a road of broken glass, he didn't ask for my CV, he asked for a tourniquet. If you think I will be silent to keep a job, you don't know the woman who raised me. I will speak when I must. And right now I must say this. The people who shot at a podium to silence a father and a daughter do not care about ethics. They care about power. Let's not hand it to them by devouring each other. She exhaled, not for breath, but for punctuation. I stand here as a journalist who still believes facts can outshout fear, and as a daughter who will not hide. If the president loses because he chose to tell the truth, then this country wins something bigger than an election. It wins a future I can live in. She stepped back. For a moment, there was no sound. The strange suspension when a nation decides whether to boo or breathe. Then the applause rose like a tide, uneven but swelling. Meeting her at the edge of that cliff she had walked to alone. Chaik moved from the wing, not with the choreography of a campaign, but with the staggering relief of a man who has found what he did not know he was still missing. He didn't take the lectern. He didn't reach for a flag. He reached for her. Up close, Amarachi saw the unslept hours under his eyes, the unguarded whisper he saved for only this moment. I'm sorry for all the years, he said, and the mic, left on, carried the sentence into households where fathers and daughters had their own distances. He turned to the crowd. I will answer every question. I will submit to every inquiry about her employment and my decisions. My enemies will call this weakness. But if telling the truth is weak, then may my country outgrow strong men. The roar came again, not unanimous, not pure, but honest. Later, in a quieter room where the cameras cooled and the staff counted trending tags like omens, Amarachi and Chaik stood by a window and watched Abuja breathe. Chinello, patched in by video call, cried without drama and told them both to eat before their blood sugar made them foolish on live TV. No one mentioned polls. No one knew if the election would tilt for or against them. It did not matter tonight. The story had been retaken by its authors. The man who almost died under a rifle's crosshair and the woman who almost died on a road of broken glass stood in the wash of fluorescent light, ordinary and rebuilt. Outside, the city hummed its arguments. Inside, a father memorized his daughter's laugh, and a daughter let herself believe a lullaby could be a bridge rather than a ghost. And somewhere in the future, no camera to witness it, no pundit to twist it, a door would open in a modest Enugu house, and 3 people would sit at a table, and someone would hum to keep back tears, and the world would be smaller, kinder, possible. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.